Some of the services we take for granted in daily life could easily be disrupted if Russia chose to do so. According to NATO intelligence officials, the Russians have plans in place to take out the West's internet. Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, said as much when he warned that nothing was holding Russia back from destroying the ocean floor cable communications. Medvedev issued the warning in the context of the Nord Stream 2 sabotage, but Russia has already carried out attacks on telecommunication networks on a smaller scale. Its ships and submarines are believed to be mapping underwater internet cables, while its jamming systems are accused of interfering with GPS navigation. These are not mere random acts of sabotage. The Russians are signaling that they could wreak havoc with the West's electronic infrastructure. Medvedev is a close ally of Putin and he has a long record of making provocative claims, but this isn't just political posturing. The focus on undersea cables ties to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Throughout the war, the Russians had declared red lines at every stage. Don't threaten Crimea, don't attack Donbass, don't expand NATO, don't violate Russian borders, etc. Yet, at every stage, it turned out to be a bluff. Russia's red lines have been crossed so often that they're starting to look like checkered flags. Now Russia wants to cross some NATO red lines and see how they respond. Escalation management is what they call it. Part of conflict is knowing and planning where the enemy's critical infrastructure is. Russia is doing just that. However, everyone is less safe for it. The thing with this type of escalation is that it only needs to go wrong once. In every advanced economy, digital life is the norm, and it has been for some time. However, even today, when abroad, internet access suddenly becomes a luxury. That's where today's sponsor comes in. Saily offers affordable internet plans for over 50 countries across the globe. They do this through an eSim, which is a digital SIM that is built into most modern phones. It works just like a physical SIM card, but without having to insert anything into your device. All you need to do is download the Saily app on your device, select one of the plans for the country you'll be traveling to, and finally activate that plan just before your plane departs. When you land, you'll have a working internet connection. It's a breeze to set up, and the pricing beats the overpaid local SIM cards. Saily also offers 24/7 support in case you're having any trouble, and they'll even give you a full refund if the eSIM doesn't work for some reason. What's more, by signing up, you will be supporting my channel and make more content possible. We could do so many more videos and cover more topics, but we need sponsors to cover the costs. YouTube revenues alone aren't cutting it. So go to saily.com/CaspianReport, download Saily, and use CaspianReport coupon code to get 15% off any of your chosen plans. Our world is increasingly dependent on the internet. Data flowing between continents keeps the global economy afloat. However, about 95% of international data goes through submarine cables. Underneath the surface is a vast network of fiber optic cables that spans the globe. Here is what it looks like. Worldwide, there are more than 1,400 landing sites that connect some 500 active and planned cables. This vast infrastructure, spanning roughly 1.4 million kilometers in length, forms the internet's backbone. Since user data, cloud drives, emails, and applications are often stored in data centers dispersed around the globe, submarine cables are necessary to connect continents and data centers with one another. That's how modern life works. Nearly all commercial transactions, social networking, remote work, cloud computing, 5G networks, and even content creation, like this video, are made possible thanks to the fiber optic cables running across the ocean floor. An estimated $10 trillion worth of financial transactions go through these cables every single day. Reliance on this infrastructure is set to grow. The Internet of Things is still an ongoing process. More and more consumer electronics and devices communicate and exchange data over the Internet. But above all, the AI revolution will drive a surge in demand for data center computing. AI systems require massive amounts of data to function. As their usage expands, bandwidth and low latency connections will become more necessary than before, which will make submarine cables even more vital to our connected world. So, submarine cables will continue to shape our world. On the flip side, the strategic importance of subsea cables makes them high-value military targets. Russia has an advantage here. Since it's effectively landlocked from the open oceans, Moscow has always focused on land-based infrastructure. Even today, its internet connectivity to Europe and Central Asia is mainly land-based. This then makes Russia less reliant on submarine cables than the rest of the world. And it's precisely this land-based advantage that encourages the Russians to target the subsea cables of their enemies more so than any other nation. The Nord Stream sabotage, recently confirmed to be conducted by the Ukrainians, demonstrates just how vulnerable undersea infrastructure truly is. Now, the Russians believe it's their turn to test the waters. In May 2023, NATO's intelligence chief warned that Russian surface vessels and submarines were observed mapping internet cables in Europe and North America. They were doing surveys near critical undersea infrastructure. Later, in October, a cable linking Sweden and Estonia was damaged, which happened to be one of the areas where the Russians had been spotted. Telecommunications between Sweden and Estonia were disrupted until redundancy cables rerouted data. Russia denied any wrongdoing, but Sweden's prime minister said the damage was purposeful. This type of sabotage is just a taste of things to come. If the Atlantic Ocean, North Sea, or even the Baltic Sea cables were to be damaged or disabled, swaths of the internet services we take for granted would be wiped out. This would include calls, streaming, and financial transactions. The world, as we know it, would never be the same. The internet is not the only network Russia is probing. Russia is now actively interfering with GPS navigation systems, causing havoc on commercial airline routes. In April 2024, GPS interference grounded flights from Helsinki, Finland to Tartu, Estonia. Russia was accused of attacking GPS navigation systems but denied any involvement. Targeting GPS systems and submarine cables is part of Russia's gray zone policy, which revolves around covert actions that fall below the threshold of open warfare. These actions are harmful, but not harmful enough to retaliate and risk total war. Gray zone policy is the space between peace and war, provided there is plausible deniability. Russia has long developed its gray zone capacity and has gotten pretty good at it. What it lacks in military might on the battlefield, it more than makes up in gray zone interference. Seen from this angle, submarine cables are perfect for gray zone tactics. Legally, the task of protecting undersea cables falls on the private companies that own and maintain them. However, Microsoft doesn't have a navy, and the current international framework for submarine cable sabotage is complicated. Different private companies abide by different legal regulations, all tied to different international regimes. Even more complex, different parties are involved depending on the location of the sabotage. The regulations for territorial waters are different from those on the continental shelf. The most complicated situation is if sabotage occurs in international waters. There is no framework to hold the perpetrator accountable. International law for this specific issue just doesn't exist. So, it can be nearly impossible to reach a consensus, let alone determine responsibility and punishment, which is why Russia has been able to get away with its actions thus far. In May 2022, one of the two cables linking the Svalbard archipelago with mainland Norway stopped working. Data flowing to and from the archipelago was cut, and air traffic in the region was reduced. The parallel Svalbard cables provide almost all the data from polar orbiting satellites to the rest of the world. So, when one of the two cables malfunctioned, it raised alarm bells. When the cable was brought up from the seabed, investigators noticed extensive damage. The outermost layer had been peeled off, and the reinforcement layer was broken. No natural phenomenon can cause such damage to fiber optic cables. Human activity was at play. Interestingly, Russian trawler ships had been observed crossing the Svalbard cable more than 140 times over a period of months before the data disruption. For added context, a trawler is a fishing vessel that catches fish by dragging a large net. It's not hard to imagine how such a vessel could be weaponized. Just tamper with the net, make it heavier and bulkier like an anchor, and then drag it back and forth long enough to damage subsea infrastructure. It would be the perfect crime. Russia's use of civilian ships gives it plausible deniability. It's difficult to pin sabotage on the Kremlin since the vessels responsible for the damage are technically civilian. The Russians know this, which is why they often deploy civilian ships to do the dirty work. In fact, the Russian Navy has a specific civilian body for precisely this mission. It's called the Main Directorate for Deep Sea Research, or GOCHI for short, and it's one of the most secretive components of the Russian Navy. Officially, the GOCHI exists as a scientific mission and is independent of the Naval Command. In reality, however, most of its personnel are recruited from the Navy itself. The GOCHI operates a number of specialized platforms, ships, and submarines. In recent years, many of these civilian scientific vessels have been detected near undersea cable routes. Russian activity is particularly high in the Atlantic Ocean, the Baltic Sea, and the North Sea. For instance, the 107-meter research vessel Yantar has been seen loitering near submarine cables off the coast of Ireland. The Yantar is equipped with various sensors and has submersibles capable of cutting submarine cables. By having this ship move around sensitive subsea infrastructure, Russia is signaling its intent and capacity to exploit vulnerabilities in submarine cables should the NATO-Russia conflict go hot. Medvedev's rhetoric, coupled with Russian activities near cable infrastructure, shows that this is no routine bluff. Russia views submarine cables as the West's single point of failure and its greatest leverage precisely because it has the land-based advantage going into the fight. The Russians can wreak havoc on the West's way of life should they choose to do so. NATO countries have stepped up their surveillance and patrols in vulnerable areas, but it's not enough. The ocean is a big place. Admittedly, most of the subsea infrastructure is designed with levels of redundancy to handle frequent damage. The most economically strategic landing sites have multiple underwater cables, allowing data to be rerouted smoothly if one line is affected. This redundancy buys NATO some time, but only so much. Repairing cables can take months to complete. Thus, if cables are taken out simultaneously, a collapse would be imminent. So if America is to even the playing field with Russia, it needs to encourage its NATO allies to build up cable repair capacity, increase the number of cable ships, and streamline the legal process. Every additional redundancy will strengthen NATO's subsea infrastructure and buy the West additional negotiating power vis-à-vis Russia. The problem, however, is that cable infrastructure is expensive. The cost of a new cable ship can be as high as $100 million. The West will need to set aside tens of billions to develop new redundancies. It falls on the Americans to convince their NATO allies to make greater commitments. Still, all these measures building up repair capacity and streamlining legal processes are not enough to secure the digital backbone of the global economy. NATO is well aware of that, which is why it is working on a new monitoring system. Since it's nearly impossible to patrol undersea all the time, especially across the Atlantic Ocean, defending submarine cables must therefore involve some sort of computing power. So, across Europe and North America, NATO officials are currently bringing together military and civilian officials to develop a new massive alert system for thousands of kilometers of undersea infrastructure. Northern Europe is the laboratory for this innovation. What we know so far is that the monitoring system will rely on sensors from cables and acoustic sensors attached to wind turbines. When synced together into a system, NATO command would be able to detect anomalies in the seabed environment and alert operators. But this system is very much in its infancy, and even if it were to be operational, it would still not be enough to deter the Russians. What NATO needs is a contingency system capable of automatically rerouting data to offset cable damage. Satellites might be part of the solution. In recent years, thousands of satellites have been launched into orbit to expand internet coverage across the globe. Elon Musk's Starlink plans to have 42,000 satellites in orbit by 2027, Amazon's Project Kuiper aims for 3,000 satellites, and Britain's OneWeb is going for as many as 1,600 satellites. However, unlike common belief, satellites cannot replace submarine cables. They are designed to complement submarine cables, not as an alternative. Subsea cables can handle hundreds of terabytes of data per second, while satellites cannot even reach a fraction of that bandwidth. However, satellite networks have a key advantage over undersea cable networks. They can connect individual homes, businesses, and communities in rural and remote locations. If satellite network coverage is available, the user needs only to buy an uplink kit to get online. Meanwhile, it takes months to lay an undersea internet cable, and that excludes the planning process beforehand, which can take years because of licensing, environmental, and legal regulations. Satellite systems don't need any of that. This is why some NATO officials have suggested to create a contingency system that would automatically reroute communications via satellite networks should submarine cables in certain areas be tampered with. Swaths of the internet would still be taken out in case of an attack, since satellites just cannot handle the bandwidth needed. However, essential systems could remain online, which would buy the West invaluable time to regroup, repair the damage, and come up with a response. Even so, no technology can replace submarine cables entirely. They are and will remain the world's information superhighways, providing high bandwidth connections that fuel economic growth, boost employment, and encourage innovation. However, without coordinated international efforts to safeguard these cables, the risks of disruption, espionage, and economic instability will persist. If no deterrence is established, one at a time or all at once, fiber optic cables will fall from the balcony. I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. Thank you for your time, and Saul.